things that have happened in Poland made me think, oh, there's like a pattern of civilian infrastructure experiencing these attacks or these sort of, disruptions. Like, what could it be if you attack the biggest infrastructure? And in most countries, that is the power grid.
Welcome to the Warsaw Wire, a podcast about Poland's economy and energy. I'm Alicja Ptak, Deputy Editor-in-Chief at Notes from Poland. Poland today sits on the edge of the war. It is not fighting, but cannot ignore. As a key transit hub for Western support to Ukraine and a frontline NATO state, it is rethinking not only its military defenses, but also resilience of the systems that keep the country alive. The power grid, vast, mostly invisible and essential, became a potential battlefield. Recently, Louisa Naks, a London-based video journalist with the Wall Street Journal, reported from Poland on how the country's grid operator is preparing for the possibility of war, drawing lessons from Ukraine. Today, rather than unpacking the technical details, I want to explore her experience reporting on this story, what drew her to it, what struck her most, and what it means to cover Poland from the outside. Louisa, welcome to the Warsaw Wire.
Hi, thanks for having me.
For listeners who haven't seen your piece, can you briefly outline what is the story about?
So it's a short documentary. It takes us on a journey through Poland, sort of looking at the vulnerabilities of civilian infrastructure and what Poland is doing to protect it. We mainly focus on the energy grid, but because obviously it's like such a huge integral part of Poland's civilian infrastructure, but we also speak to people who have experienced personal sort of loss. We speak to a couple who live in Wyrki, whose home was destroyed when there was a drone incursion into Poland last year. So we've kind of like tied all these stories together, and it takes us on a journey from Wyrki then around to see how, Poland is zooming out and protecting its infrastructure on a bigger scale.
I wonder because, to be honest, I am personally a little bit of an energy nerd, so I love power grid. But to a general reader or a general, let's say, general news reporter, I think that power grid can be sometimes a quite technical subject. So I wonder what exactly drew you to this story? Was it like a specific event, conversation, report, or something else that made you think this is something that we need to report on?
So because I'm a video journalist, I think mainly in terms of sort of like, what can I see? And I actually think power grids are really interesting to look at. I mean, you've got these huge substations, you've got these big sort of like chimneys burning and like all these like electricity pylons, and like it's not the most beautiful on the surface, but it's actually really interesting and like super visual. Like we went to a substation and like you're walking around, you can hear the hum of the electricity, and it's a thing that every single country has. Like you look out of your window, you'll see a power line and you take it so for granted, but it's like the things for me that are most kind of, like something that everyone can relate to. Everyone can find a story in that, and you can find a way to sort of, be like, oh, actually, this could impact me. So that's kind of the main thing. I was kind of looking at like the visuals and then what those visuals could sort of, how they can relate to audiences around the entire world.
That's actually very interesting what you have seen, because I didn't see that. A few years ago, together with a few other journalists who are covering the clean energy transition, we actually talked about this, like what are the stories that are underreported. And I mentioned power grid, and I thought that power grid is underreported because it is not visual, that it's easier to show, I don't know, wind turbines on a beautiful landscape, or photovoltaic farms, right? It's very visual, and yet the power grid is more elusive, we might say. So I didn't see that, but I find it fascinating that you did, and I wonder what was the element that made you able to tell the story for the general audience? Was that the war element that unlocked this story?
I think it was largely inspired by obviously what's happening in Ukraine. Russia is targeting Ukraine's power grid. It's been very successful in causing a lot of damage and causing a lot of issues for civilians. And like that kind of really struck me. I was like, wow, they can take out this power grid and look what damage it causes to so many people. So I was like, that's something that's really kind of like, it really struck me as like an issue. And then I sort of just came across this like press release that Poland's state grid operator, PSC, would be signing a cooperation agreement with the Polish military. And I was like, this is really interesting. I don't know many other countries that are sort of involving the military in protecting their infrastructure. And obviously you had the drone incursion I mentioned earlier in September, and like the rail sabotage acts and all these kind of like little things that have happened in Poland made me think, oh, there's like a pattern of sort of civilian infrastructure is sort of experiencing these attacks or these sort of, disruptions, and it is causing problems. Like, what could it be if you attack the biggest infrastructure? And in most countries, that is the power grid.
And did you worry that this story might get too technical?
I mean, it's always a thought process that goes through your mind. But again, like, I think it just depends on who you speak to. We were really fortunate. We spoke to some really fantastic people who really helped break it down for us and describe it in a sense that, like a normal person can understand rather than, going into the details.
Yes, I really enjoyed the metaphor given by one of your interviewees of power grid being like a nervous system of a country. It was quite poetic, to be honest.
It was fantastic. As soon as he said that, I was like, wow, this is perfect.
And what struck you most during your reporting?
I think what really struck me is the difference in mindset between people in Poland and people in the UK. Just in terms of like anticipating what could happen in the next sort of months, years, decades, whatever. Obviously, we hear a lot in the UK what the government is doing. They're kind of having these initiatives, these sort of like they're putting sanctions, they're trying to clamp down on certain things. But in Poland, it feels like everything is a little bit more practical. It feels like just the everyday person is getting prepared mentally, even if nothing does happen. People are just kind of switching their mentality to think like something could happen. This is how I prepare. Whereas if you speak to a everyday person in the UK, I think, the potential of war and sort of hybrid attacks, etc., it's not really at the forefront of people's minds. Like hybrid war is not really a word in people's vocabulary here. Whereas when you speak in Poland, people are sort of already used to it and already expecting it in a way.
Why do you think it is so? Is it just the proximity to the war in Ukraine, or is there something else?
I think it's probably a combination. I think obviously the proximity to the war in Ukraine, it's a lot closer. I mean, Poland has had these sort of incidents happen, which the government has very openly blamed on Russian sabotage operations. You had the train railway disruption, which Tusk has, pointed to Russia being behind it. There have been arsons at shopping malls, which they have linked to, Russian or people working on behalf of Russian intelligence services. So I just think it's a little bit more open that this is the threat. People are just a little bit more sort of, focused on that. Whereas in the UK, I guess they've not really had the same level of risk. So it's not as big a it's not as kind of to the forefront of people's minds about it.
So one part of your reporting that really stuck with me, it was the part that you made in an underground bunker control room for the PSE, so the power grid operator. Can you tell us a little bit more about that experience?
Yeah, I mean, the underground bunker is this underground nuclear bunker. They actually built it many, many years ago. They built it after 9/11, and they were, operating. That's basically, it's like the heart of the Polish energy grid. That's where everything is controlled. Like there's all these big screens and, there are people there like basically balancing the grid. And what was really cool is like, they're like, oh yeah, we built this after 9/11 because we thought that there would be sort of, maybe the world has changed. And then they were saying that, in the years following, it seemed maybe a bit excessive to have this in this very like, secure location. But the guys were telling us that, now that obviously with how the world has changed, how the war is happening in Ukraine, that they're super grateful that they have this, secure place where they can monitor this most critical infrastructure.
And why was it crucial for them to have the control room in a secure location?
Just for safety. It's what controls, it's as I said, it's the heart of the energy grid. It's a very important place. They need to look after it.
And what was the hardest thing about this story?
So the hardest thing is getting people from around the world to be interested in in the Polish energy grid. On the surface, you say, "Hey, I'm doing a story about Poland's energy grid." Someone who doesn't know much about Poland, who maybe lives hundreds, thousands of kilometers away, they don't know anything about the country, let alone about the power grid. So the biggest challenge was like, how do I get this story to be something that somebody millions of miles away, hundreds of miles away even, would be like, I want to click on that and like see what's going on. I think that was the biggest challenge.
And how did you manage to deal with it?
I think the way we dealt with it was great. We sort of spoke to like civilians. We kind of like broke down obviously like how civilian infrastructure is so important, both on like a personal scale and also on a bigger scale, on a countrywide scale. And I feel like that's kind of, people can see that and relate to. We spoke to just some normal families who are kind of, experienced these horrible losses, and people can relate to that. When you have a human telling their story, you can be like, oh yeah, I can relate to that. Oh my God, what if that happened to me? I think that was the best way of doing it.
So in a way, the story connected both the personal and the national.
Exactly.
Through the grid. Did you learn, during your reporting, did you learn something that you wanted to include in your story, but for example, you didn't have space for it?
I mean, we had some amazing interviews which we didn't have time. Like everyone we spoke to was really fantastic. Like, I mean, I could have just spent hours talking to these people. They were really, really, really open with us, and it was really great to be invited into people's homes, to see so many different parts of how the grid worked. I mean, you talk about the technical elements, I got really interested in how it all works, because I mean, like, I had absolutely no idea how all the substations work, etc. So I actually found that really interesting, but obviously time constraints, you can't keep everything in.
So I'm also wondering, because in the face of rising threats, hybrid threats from Russia, many European countries are tightening their defenses. So what made Poland stand out to you as a place to tell this story?
So I guess it's like obviously location-wise, it's right next to Ukraine. And it's also a NATO country. It's a member of the European Union. So like geographically, it's a great place to sort of like dig into like what is the front line of NATO doing. But secondly, Poland is actually doing a lot of stuff to protect its grid. They've got a lot of like, they decoupled from the Russian grid. They help the Baltic countries, join the European grid. They also supply energy to Ukraine. So it's kind of this like perfect like crossroads in sort of like, electricity in the whole of Europe, but is also very much on the front line. And the fact that they're doing so much to sort of protect their grid, they've got this helicopter unit, they've taken these steps to militarize their workers, etc., and they're training people. So it's kind of the perfect place. Like they're actually doing stuff that's visual that you can show. So you can tell this story about the importance of protecting energy grids for countries, but also showing actually these are concrete steps that Poland is taking.
And if I remember correctly, you've covered a few other stories from Poland. I think you've also covered farmers' protests on the border with Ukraine as well, right?
Yes.
Are there some themes reoccurring in your coverage of Poland?
Most of my coverage of Poland in recent years has been based on it being a frontline NATO country, really close to Russia and the threat. I did a explainer a couple of years ago about the Suwałki Gap. So most of the coverage has kind of focused on that. And I guess that's kind of, where Poland is geographically, where it stands in sort of the wider world at the moment. But I mean, there's so much more happening in Poland than just being on the front line of NATO, etc. So I'm sure there's so many more stories that can be told.
And so are there some stories about Poland that you'd love to tell but couldn't? Because, just disclaimer, I work sometimes with foreign journalists coming here to tell stories about Poland, and some issues that we are facing is that their newsrooms are so focused on the war angle that they rarely accept other stories, even though there are. So if you had no constraints, what story of Poland would you want to tell?
Wow, no constraints. I think the Polish economy is a really interesting one. Like, it's a super interesting case study, how it's managed to, grow so quickly, and their aspirations to be a G7 country, join the $1 trillion club. I think that's a really, really interesting story. But I do see that more and more Western news outlets are starting to cover that. So it's really interesting to follow.
And do you think that Poland is underreported internationally?
Yeah, it's very difficult to say. I mean, there's so much news happening in the world. There are so many countries making news, and the news cycle moves so quickly that I think, you can say any country is always going to be a little bit underreported, unless obviously, you've got, even Ukraine, right? There's a war happening, but some of the things don't get out into the press because there is just so much happening and there's so much to filter through. So I think it's obviously a challenge, but I mean, that's the news, isn't it? There's too much happening.
You're based in London, but you did spend some time in Poland, in Gdańsk, working at the Reuters Strategic Center. Is that right?
That's correct.
Is that how you became interested in Poland, or was it something else?
So my interest in Poland actually predates Reuters. So my family are from Poland. So I've spent my entire life interested in Poland. I've lived there, I've studied there, I've worked there. So the interest really goes back my entire life.
And did it feel familiar right now as a foreign correspondent coming back to Poland and reporting on these issues?
Yeah, it was really interesting because, I mean, I've not reported from Poland since I left Reuters bureau in Gdańsk in 2020. So the only times I've been to Poland since have been mainly for sort of relaxation, to see friends, to see family. So it was really interesting to be there from a work perspective and to sort of, have my journalist hat on. But it was really, really great to sort of be back speaking to people. It was very, very interesting.
And do you think that having that experience of living in this country changed the way you approached reporting on it?
Definitely. I think it actually made it easier. I think, having lived in the country, I kind of understood how everything works. Obviously, you understand the language. From when you grew up in the UK, I spoke Polish at home. I understood the language, but it's not until you actually live and work in the country that you really understand how everything works. So I think that experience really helped me to know exactly who to reach out to do this story, who are the best people to talk to, and sort of, what questions to actually ask and how it really impacts people on the ground.
Louisa Naks, video journalist with the Wall Street Journal, thank you for joining me on the Warsaw Wire.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, comment, subscribe, and share. And if you want to go deeper into how Poland is protecting its power grid, watch Louisa's piece next.